Hello everyone, I have just read chapter 11 of Luke Skywalker and the Shadows of Mindor. I got it right this time. I almost said Last of the Jedi though. So we cut with Lando, who is back on the who is again on the ship. We learn the name of the ship. They remember Alderaan. And he's looking at the forward view screens, and he orders for he says to one of the comm-ops officers, I assume, to recall all fighters and initiate a search and rescue, and see that when Lord Mandalore lands, he receives Lando's compliments and gratitude, and as well as his urgent requests for the honour of his company at his earliest convenience. And the captain, oh, it wasn't the com-ops, it was the captain, okay. It says that that's the general orders, and Lando turns to the com-ops officer and says to get it a secure channel with Wedge Antilles, and the com-ops officer says that the channel, that subspace is heavily jammed, and Lando makes the request again, and he says that once he gets that channel, to tell him that he's waiting for him in the Deck 7 fighter bay. And he says that tell him he's been waiting. And reminds him that he doesn't like waiting. And he says to let Lord Mandalore know where they are, as in Fenchisa. And he says to 3PO, who has been inconspicuously eavesdropping by an engineering console, and says for him to come with Lando. And they make their way into the turbo lift, and just as it even starts to move, there's a sudden jolt, and Lando asks what was that rhetorically, and 3PO actually starts answering, and Lando says that it was a rhetorical question, and 3PO says that he understands and starts talking, and Lando tells him to stop and asks, and he takes up his comlink to ask what that was, and they say, and someone says that it's unknown and they're looking into it, and 3PO still is continuing saying, "I misunderstood your rhetorical intent, General, because I can acquire that information for you." And Lando is a bit confused, and you can. And 3PO says that he most certainly can, because the ship knows. And he explains that the Mon Calamari ships are quite intelligent. And it doesn't mean it in an offensive way, but they are more capable than any organic brain. And he starts communing with the ship. And Lando asks and when 3PO goes, "What? Oh, that's awful. Oh my goodness!" And he even covers his vocabulator. And Lando asks what the ship said. And 3PO explains that he doesn't know. And 3PO explains that the ship made an improper suggestion. And says that and 3PO says that the ship is a terrible flirt, and you know how sailors can be, and Lando tells him to flirt back so he can get the information, and 3PO's isn't really that appealed to the idea, but eventually Lando's able to convince him to do so. And we're told a bit about Mon Calamari fighter bays, and he finds Wedge and Taicho Kelchu. It's such a great name, Taicho Kelchu. And he's wanting to berate them, and he says that you got here fast to Wedge. And we're told that Wedge's still at attention sounded not like the slightest bit like an insubordinate troublemaker who was roughly 1 atomic diameter short of demotion and serious break time. And he says that he just happens to recall that Lando doesn't like being kept waiting. And as Lando starts to berate him, another shake hits the ship, and 3PO comes round And he explains that the ship informs me that it was a gravity shear of unknown origin, interfering with the ship's engines as well as its artificial gravity and inertial compensators, not to mention placing substantial physical stress on its structure. Oh, oh my! Oh my! That's terribly dangerous, isn't it? I'd say so, Wedge said, but I'm not ready for demolition. Wedge went on as if the droid hadn't spoken. And Wedge explains that they call them gravity bombs, and they're point source grav projectors that go faster than any A-wing that's on a crash course on a black hole. And he explains that they're ballistic with no drive signature, so you can't detect them until you're already in their field, and already in their radius of effect. And they're dangerous enough by themselves, and we're told that something like them were loaded onto the fake shuttle that took out the Justice. And we saw that the worst part is that they, I'm not going to say that, but they really play up gravity stations, and if the gravity station's shadow spawn are scattered throughout the asteroids, and we're told there's not a navicomputer in the fleets that can predict the orbits of practically anything in the whole system now, and that's why they got the slashies sweeping the fields, because they're trying to pry open a window to get before the star goes supercritical. And Lando finds that he's more interested in the current tactical problem than wanting to berate and punish Rogue Squadron. And he asks how's it going, and Wedge says that it could be better, and the planetoids aim to keep the process self-sustaining, but they still got an uncountable amount of TIEs out there who are still pounding the slashies and hitting them whenever they make a move. And he says their best estimate is periodic windows starting to open is within 20. The best estimate of periodic windows starting to open is within 18 to 20 hours. And Mindor says that it's not that bad. And then Wedge brings up that they only have about 3 hours before the flares start going off. And they can't really tell when or how massively, and there's just no way to reliably predict, and the gravity bombs could still screw it all up. And Lando says that the gravity bombs have to be coming from somewhere, otherwise it all have burned out or crashed into something by now. And Taicho says that Solo did say he spotted a major installation on the planet in the mouth of a volcano, and it says says it was just about the last communication we had from him and Princess Leia before we lost contact. And Lando asks what they were doing there, and Taicho explains that they went to rescue Luke, and Lando starts to ask about Luke, and he stops himself, and 3PO goes, Master Luke is in danger. Oh, General Calrissian, you can't just leave him. What about R2? And Lando says that no one's leaving anybody, and he says, we're getting scan bounce from the atmosphere, heavy metals and intense mag fields, what do you have on it? And Wedge says that it's breathable enough if you don't mind coughing, but it's just so charged that nothing they got will penetrate it very well. Will penetrate very well, as it says. And so if you really want to know what's down there, you have to go down there. And Lando says that so if their scans won't get through, it will block any kind of radiation. And Wedge frowns and says that's but he has to tell them that he doesn't much like what the direction this is going, and they don't even know how many troops they have, and they don't really know their defences. And Lando says good, Wedge goes good, and Lando says that as a friend once told him that we'll say in situations like this, and says that, well, at least what he says sometimes, that never tell him the odds, which we know is Han. And Han, and we cut over to Han back in the Falcon, and he's talking to Iona. He's letting the KYD hang loosely in his finger, and Chewie is now pretty much ready to attack the the two Mindorees that he was treating, and Han tells him to go easy, and he says, "We're gonna do this the easy way. You follow?" And Aona tells him to get on the floor, and Han says that she picked a lousy time to pirate his ship, and Han asks what she thinks she's going to do with it, because Shadow Spawn's got a whole system loaded with gravity stations. It'll take them 2 days to make a jump, and the asteroids are about to start falling in the start, so if they take the ship out of the atmosphere, they'll all roast anyway. And Aona tells him that it's not their problem, because their current problem is getting on the floor. She blows the brains all, and then she says, "Your problem is getting on the floor before I blow your brains all over Princess Kissy Face." "Princess, excuse me?" Leia snaps with that instantly dangerous tone Han knew so well. He put out one arm to hold her back, but she ducks under it without breaking stride. "You want to put down the blaster and say that again? What is it with you people?" Aona said. "Get on the floor, now!" And Han says that he has a better idea, and demonstrates what he means by easy way. And Chewie grabs the throats of the two Mindorees he was treating, knocks their head together, which is described as sounding like, which made it sound very like a very large hollow top nut, landing on a very large hard rock. And the two men sag, and Chewie holds them up like a shield. And Han asks for Aona to give him back his blaster, and Aona tells, and Aona doesn't really, just refuses, and says that maybe she'll just shoot him instead, and Han tells her to knock herself out, and she tries to fire, and it doesn't work, and Han has been holding the power cell to it in his left hand the whole time. And he says, "Think I'm going to hand over a charged weapon to you?" And Aona just says to take them, and she hurls Han's blaster towards Han, and Han catches the blaster, and Aona's charging towards Han with her hands outstretched, but she doesn't get further than 2 steps because Leia knocks her over and holds her down on the floor, and Han puts the power cell back into his blaster, and the fight starts breaking out. And this is the thing about this fight. I was really struggling to follow it. I couldn't tell whether the Mindorees were in the ship, whether they were outside the ship, because what winds up happening is that Han starts shooting the what was it called, the ramp, the control to the cargo hold ramp, and it's not really made very clear as to whether are the Mindorees outside or they inside, because it seems like it switches between the two. It seems like they were outside, and then it makes it sound like they're inside the ship. But all that really matters is that R2's been able to get kind of remote control through his own way. He's able to kind of remote control close the cargo hold, and Chewie, Han, Leia and R2 wind up escaping out. Oh, and Leia's able to steal Aona's KYD-21, and they watch as and Han asks if R2 can stop the engines or controls, and R2 replies with a whistle that very much just sounds like, "Well, if you gave me more time, I could have." And Han just watches in horror as the Mindorees steal the Falcon, and Leia tries to reassure him that they'll get it back, but Han just is in disbelief, and he just watches as it flies off throughout the cave, and Han, Leia, Chewie, R2, they start making their way back through the cave. And and says, well, that could have gone better. And that's where we end that section, and we wind up going back to Lando, who's again back on the bridge, and Fen is there pacing, and he says that they can't just stand here anymore, and he has to scramble his men, and they should be out there. And Lando says, "You can join the battle if you feel that's best. I'm the last man in the galaxy who's presumed to give orders to Lord Mandalore, but the commandos aren't your men. Not right now, anyway. They work for me." And she's at a loss for words, and he says that they're cut off already, and they're going to pin them against the planet. And Lando turns with a smile, saying, "You think?" And the ComOps officer says that they have visual verification, the asteroids are inbound for the star, and the coronal entry is in 3 minutes. And Lando asks about the flare activity, and we learn that it's already begun. And the sensor analysis indicates that they're about 12 minutes away from a spike in intensity high enough to take down every deflector shield in the system, and then they maybe have about an hour, probably less than an hour, before they're all cooked. And Lando says that, okay, you heard the man, send out on all ships, disengage and make for Mindor's night side, then launch escape pods. Tell the rogues to take 2 more squadrons and cover the pods. Lando, you have to commit my men. It'll be a slaughter. No, it won't. 3 squadrons will never cover that many pods. And these marauders don't take prisoners. Doesn't matter, Lando said crisply. Let them blow up the pods. It'll keep them busy. What? All we're launching is pods. Get it? Empty pods. Lando shook his head. Think I'm about to set up my forces halfway around the planet from the bad guys? Not this, General, my friend. And Sheeza gets the idea. That's they're going to come in from the night side, and they have the planet as a shield against the stellar flares. And they come in low level through the atmosphere. But he says if you're planning to bring capital ships close to that volcano base of theirs, they first have to take out their ground-based artillery, their turbo lasers, ion cannons, and especially their gravity gun. And he asks how they fit on how Lando figures on doing that. And Lando says that might be a problem, but he says, you wouldn't happen to know where I could lay my hands on, say, 500 or 600 Mandalorian super commandos, would you? And Fen blinks a couple times, and he finds himself starting to smile, and that's where we end the chapter. This is probably the second time in this book, with the this is the second time in this book that the actual space battle has been good. It is the second time in this book the space battle has actually been good over Mindor. You know, the first time it was with Han when you finally reached the Mindor the Tasman system, and you know, making his way down to Mindor when Leia pops in. That was the other time it was good. It wasn't as complicated as I was dreading it would be. Again, the thing about the space battle in this book, I've been dreading it every single time it gets brought up. I do not enjoy the space battle stuff. So, yeah. But, you know, it's not the worst stuff. You know, it's not the worst. I did quite enjoy Lando in some of the decisions in this chapter, and I did kind of gather that, yeah, why don't you just use the planet as a shield against the flares, and they did. And they are going to. So, yeah. I think my main problem with this chapter was that I just could not follow that battle between Aona and Han, between Aona's people and Han, Leia, Chewie, and R2. It was just too confusing. It was too confusing. Were they inside the ship? Were they outside the ship? Because when the ramp lowered, I was under the impression all the Mindorees were just suddenly knocked outside the ship. But I just couldn't figure it out. And so that's why I kind of skipped over that summary and just briefly summarise how my feelings were on it. I just couldn't figure that battle out, and you know, I wasn't sure. And you know, in that scene, you know, it was surely Han hasn't got the power cell. You know, I was thinking that would be something we would have had at least an implication of happening if it did happen. But no, No, he does have the power cell. So yeah, it's going to be interesting to see how they get the Falcon back. You know, it's probably going to wind up being they get into space, and on the start, and in the Republic, and the Rapid Response Task Force starts trying to contact them. You know, and and a bunch of stuff that happens from there. You know, again, I have no idea how Corvasta or Carvasta. I think it's Corvasta. No, it is Carvasta. Sorry, I've been saying that wrong. I have no idea how he's meant to fit into this. I know he fits in. I know he appears in this book. Don't know how he appears. Unless he's one of those Mandalorian super commandos, because this book is already really jam-packed as it is. You know, unless he's among Shadow Spawn's forces or among the commandos, super commandos. I have no idea where this is leading to. I have no idea how he fits into this at all. You know, it's already jam-packed as it is. I can't see how this fits, how everything else will fit in here. But yeah, you know, we've only got 7 chapters left. You know, and we've still not really got. I mean, there's not really a lot left in the story, and there's so much still to do. You know, mind you, there is still like another 200 or so, almost another 200 chapters. Not chapters, pages. So you know, but I'm not looking forward to those chapters because they're going to be really long now. But yeah. Yeah, I enjoy this chapter. I didn't think it was terrible like chapter 4. And it was fairly entertaining, but again, the Horn battle, that was a bit difficult to follow. But yeah, it was entertaining to read, but I don't really have any strong thoughts on it, so yeah. So I guess that brings an end to this. So thank you all for watching, and goodbye. Hello everyone. So I have just read chapter 12 of Luke Skywalker and the Shadows of Mindor. I almost wanted to say Last of the Jedi again. So we open with Luke, and we're seeing into his mind, and he's feeling unbelievably cold. And he's also we're told that that the cold isn't a creepy numbness and weakness and a growing inability to enforce his hypothermic muscles to move. This cold is as frozen without the comfort of numbness. It says tiny razor-edged crystals of ice, colder than ice, so cold they burned. Cold as liquid air grew inwards through his skin at every pore, becoming hairlines of freeze that crept along his nerves. And it's also silence, and it's a bit of a weird scene to try and explain. And he's kind of dreaming. He's in such silence that there is literally nothing to hear. Not even a heartbeat. Not even, you know, the sound of blood going through your veins or anything like that. It is literally just complete silence. A silence that no physical being can hear. And Luke is dreaming kind of what the future of being in his body controlled by a black hole would be like. How he's pretty much being forced to sleep, being at the end of the universe, and he feels like he's streaming for years, millennia. And he's able to finally snap his he's able to finally think of first thought in a million years, which is sleep. This is the end of everything, nothing left but sleep. And then a second later, he's able to think that's wait, somebody else is thinking with my mind, and he's able to feel that the thought has weight and texture, and he has like an imaginary pebble in his hand, and he feels that he is the pebble, yet the pebble's also surrounding him. And there's surrounding pebbles which are pawns, and he's able to try and slowly work his way through. And he winds up hearing another voice, struggle is futile, the dark swallows everything in the end. And Luke thinks that he'll never just sleep. And so he's able to finally see a glimmer of light, that is so small he only would have noticed it because he only noticed it because it was imaginary. And he reaches out for it, and focusing his whole self into his false perceptions, he is able to kind of see where he is. However, he can't control himself. He sees through what he sees is sleeves, voluminous sleeves, which is just he's seeing the chamber he's in, and he realises that what he's seeing is not from his brain. It's like him. It's kind of like him and Cronal have swapped bodies. Again, the voice keeps encouraging him that sleep, struggle is futile, all things end, existence is an illusion, only the dark is real. And the crystals in, I guess, Cronal's head are amplifying those words. You can tell there's somebody out there, and Luke thinks it's Black Hole. And he's starting to take control of the body, the body he's in, and you can see the blue energy discharges similar to the ones in the cavern of the Shadow Throne. And this energy is doing no harm to the people gathered there. I would say that the energy was filled with that the cavern's filled with moon hats, which again are just the pawns. It's what Luke nicknames the pawns, and you can see this surrounding a large pedestal, and the energy makes its way into the pedestal. And Luke figures out that is him, that's where he is, and we're told that it doesn't particularly bother him, being after spending eternity at the end of the universe, and he thinks that mere death doesn't mean much at all, and it was better than what Black Hole was trying to do with him, or with him, or as him. And he doesn't know if he can save himself, but he thinks that he might be able to help these people, and that would have to be enough. And he reaches out to the crystals with the Force, and he finds nothing but one lone brain to grasp. And just that one brain to grasp. And though he can feel them clearly, he just can't really get a proper grasp on their will. And he realises that the pawns are the featureless graphite he had in his stream. And there's nothing but the dark, and this one pawn alone had that fissure of light. And he thinks back to one of Yoda's lessons. Into the Force you truly give yourself. All you do expresses the truth of who you are. Then through you the Force will flow, and guide your hand it will, until the greatest good might come of your smallest gesture. And we're told that Luke never really understood it and just tried to live according to its principle. But there was an image of slowly reaching to the surface of his consciousness, and again another imaginary hand, the image of his own hand delivering that punch to Nick just to the right of the centre of Nick's forehead, and which had been precisely the impact required to crack the crystalline matrix inside Nick's brain, which is what stops the dead man interlock. And we're told that it was a simple act of mercy, born of no other desire than to end a conflict without taking a life. And he feels the connection now, and he thinks how he could control Nick through his will, and save himself, and make him a puppet of his own, and make his escape, and we're told, or he could abandon his sphere and express the truth of who he was. And this isn't even a choice for Luke, and instead of a command, he just gives a friendly suggestion to Nick, which is, "Hey Nick, why don't you wake up?" And Cronal starts sensing that something has gone terribly wrong. He starts sensing that something's gone terribly wrong, and he gets interrupted by blazing klaxons. If only he had a few minutes more, he would have completed the whole thing. But he notices that Click is trying to contact him, and he won't move so swiftly that he almost forgets to send it to just being voice, to just send it to the voice, I guess, just to communicate through his voice. And he thinks it would have been a disaster if he let Nick see who he truly was. Have I gone too far ahead? Oh no, I won't. Actually. No. It's just the pages are stuck together. Hate when that happens, don't you? He says to Click, "Wasn't my order clear? Just no wasn't my order, Group Captain? Was my order unclear? No interruptions." The Group Captain, of course, could hear only the computer-synthesized version of Shadow Spawn's sepulchral base, though. "My lord, the rebels are attacking." "How do a few fighter squadrons constitute an emergency so dire that you would defy my direct order? Destroy them, and don't bother me again." "More than fighters, my lord. A battlecruiser of Mon Calamari design has initiated orbital bombardments, targeting our ground emplacements. Primarily our ion turbo cannons. We believe it's in preparation for a surface assault." "A Mon Calamari battle cruiser? Impossible. Their sole Mon Cal was destroyed by our gravity slice." "Yes, my lord, but this is a new one." "Impossible. No new cruiser could have entered the system so soon. Our gravity stations should keep them at least a light hour away." "My lord, the rebels have opened a temporary jump window." And Colonel just realises that, as ridiculous as all this is, it's all true, and it's a reality, and it's not impossible at all. And he thinks now the dark may swallow every miserable rebel. And he asks Click why he wasn't informed. And Click starts saying, "My lord, your order," and Cronal says, "Call out every squadron. Throw in every reserve. Get every single fighting craft in action now. If you have to draft deckhands to fly them. I want those rebels so busy they don't even have time to watch the star flares that will kill them. Do you understand?" And Click goes, "Yes, my lord." And he also requests for Click to get a company of his best commandos to the election centre entry, and to hold that door at all costs, no matter what happens with the battle, and that no rebel should be allowed to interrupt what's happening within the election centre. And Click must see to it personally, and Click says that he will take personal command and make sure that no rebel enters the election centre so long as one trooper is alive. And Cronal tells Click that he has full authority over this. He has complete authority to command the situation, and he requests to not be disturbed again. And he cuts off the communication, and he tries to get back into a comfortable position. And we're told that he was so close, only a few minutes more was all he needed to take Luke's body and get the Jedi's power. It says he's so close. He was so close. A few minutes more was all he needed to give himself youth and strength and a Jedi's power and the name and face of a hero. And he puts the sunset crown back onto his head because he retracted it before, and he starts taking in deep breaths, and he seizes and pawns as little glitter flies on a moonless night, and he focuses his mind on them as if he could grasp them and squeeze them until he was wholly inside them, and then until they all synchronise with Cronal. Whenever he takes a breath, they take a breath. Whenever he sighs, they sigh, until their hearts are literally beating in synchrony with him. And it's all but one. And we're told, and Nick starts awakening up, and he thinks that man, he's been having the weirdest dream, and he rubs his eyes, he tries to rub his eyes, but he notices it says he tried to rub his eyes, but his hands were tangled in something. What was this? Sleeves? Since when did he wear pyjamas? Especially pyjamas made out of brocade, so thick that he could have used it as a survival tent on a Carthrexian glacier. And his head hurt too, as his neck was stiff because his head had gained a couple of dozen kilos. Must have been some serious party to leave him with this bad of a hangover. And when he does finally free his hands to rub his eyes and get his vision back, he notices he's in the stone chamber. And with about, it says 40 other people, but it's 39. 40 is the total. Nick is the 40th, as established in the previous chapter, in chapter 10. And he realises that this hasn't all been a dream, and it was all reality, and he wonders how long he's been standing like this, and for a long moment he doesn't move, and he doesn't know exactly how long he has until he has to move until he attracts Cronal's attention. And we're told that he has a pretty good idea of what the old Rushkak's reaction was going to be. And again, we're told that the whole chamber, the walls, the floor and the ceiling is made out of melt massive. And we're told that this was the problem with Jedi. Whenever a Jedi was around, you were always going to wind up in some kind of trouble that nobody in the galaxy could possibly survive, not even the Jedi himself. And we're told that this time it isn't even about dying, it was about getting stuck as Black Hole's sock puppets for the rest of his natural life, and so he wonders what he's supposed to do. And he thinks doing nothing won't make anything better, and he feels Black Hole in his head, and he knows that he could take control at any moment. And we're told that the only reason Nick has any self-awareness is because Black Hole is entirely focused on Luke inside the stone slab. And it's all that it says overall it looks like both of them were pretty well fragged. But you know, he reminded himself, that kid is supposed to be a Skywalker. Nick had never been superstitious, but there was something about that name. It seemed to carry the promise, or at least the possibility, that the day might be saved in some incomprehensibly improbable fashion, even if the situation was so clearly hopeless that only a lunatic would even try. And he pulls off his crown, and it hurts a lot, and again makes the same flesh-rippy sounds that it made earlier. And it really hurts when he goes, okay, ow, that's it. Nobody's putting that thing back on me, because that was the last time I want to take it off. And Cronal shouts that no, it's not possible, and not now when he's so close. And he gets Click back, and he starts crooning with Click again. And he says that they're on their way. And Cronal says, when you get there, secure and seal the door. If anyone tries to come out, kill them. And he adjusts the sunset crown upon his wrinkled scalp again. And We're told that as for the inside of the election centre, he can handle that himself. Can he now? So Nick starts patting down his robes to try and find a liquefier. He can't find any. And, if... And, we're told, but he came up blank, of course, because nothing was ever that easy. Not for him. Nick was absolutely certain that on the day of his birth, the Force had looked down upon his life, smiled and cheerfully made an obscene gesture, or something. And he looks around the room and sees again the 39 pawns, who are mostly identical. And he wonders who has the liquefier. He wonders if is he supposed to search every single one of them. But he remembers that the charge a liquefier has is similar to a charge from a stun blast on the blaster. And he looks at his crown and he picks it up, makes his way over to the door, and he puts it over his head to start speaking with Shadow Spawn's voice. And he calls for the guard, and a stormtrooper comes through and he whacks him hard. And we're told that it buckles the stormtrooper's knees, and he thinks about about an ancient adage on his own world, which is anything worth hitting is worth hitting twice, and he smacks him again, which lays him over to the floor. Another stormtrooper starts opening fire, but Nick uses the crown as a carbonite shield, and he knocks over the troop. He knocks the other trooper off balance by ramming into him, and with the first guard's blaster, he shoots them, and he thinks that it mustn't be that stormtrooper armor mustn't be as sturdy as as carbonite, and he sees a long down-sloping corridor, and he just thinks that this is great. So on top of everything else, he doesn't even know where he is. And then he starts saying that this is at the far end, and we're told that before the door at the far end of the corridor opens to reveal a squad of stormtroopers, most likely wondering what all the shooting was about. And he just mutters to himself that everything's getting better and better. And so he drags the unconscious trooper inside and then blasts the door panel to close the door. And he looks around and sees all the pawns are now facing him. And he just thinks that can't be good. And a group of the pawns start to block the pedestal, and another group start to circle around Nick to stop him with their arms outstretched, and they're not making a sound. And of course it's just because they can't speak, but Nick is still creepy. And he sets the carbine onto full auto, and he hesitates. And he has an extraordinarily vivid vision of trying to explain to Luke, who had saved his life hours earlier based on nothing more than a pun and a feeling that he might be innocent, about how he blasted away about 30-some innocent men and women, just so he could get him out of there. And he gets the feeling that Luke would sacrifice himself for 30 innocent lives, or maybe 10 or 1. And he mutters to himself that maybe even just one not so innocent life, like his own. And he sets it to stun, and he thinks about how he hates Jedi. And then he thinks about how he has no idea how a stun blast would affect the pawns given their controls, and the crowns literally go straight into their brains. And the only thing worse than having to explain that he killed all the pawns intentionally to Luke would be how he killed them without by being so stupid as to overload their brains with the stun. So again, remembering that the floor is made out of melt massive, and that a stun blast can melt massive, can liquefy it, he starts shooting the floor. And all the pawns start falling into the little pools that are being created. And Nick starts to find it quite comical. And even though he can't harden them, because it's not a natural liquefier, of course, he can't harden the stone back, he is able to still, he is still able to, keep them stuck there because the pawns are trying to scramble over each other to get up. And Nick is finding it funny, and he just thinks it would be funnier if he could actually solidify it. And he starts running over to Luke, and he does stumble a bit as he's having to run over all the pools that he's just created. But he winds up being able to stand on top of the he's able to stand on top of the pedestal, and he just fires down with the stun blasts, and it starts melting the pedestal, and he finds himself sitting on Luke's chest, and he starts being pulled under, and he's starting to be ripped, and his robe gets started to be torn apart from him. The pawns are clawing at him, and then he hears Luke's lightsaber zoom zoom past, and it's being thrown around the room, slicing the crowns of the pawns, which then the crowns kind of break apart. And Luke tells him to be quiet because this isn't as easy as it looks, and eventually he takes out all the pawns. And Luke says, "Alright, what do we still need?" And once it comes back to his hand, and he's struck all the crowns and the pawns, and Nick says it's not like they're out of trouble yet. And Luke knows that already knows the stormtroopers are outside the door, and he says he's sure they can figure something out as he hefts his lightsaber. And Nick explains now they don't know where they are. They're lost in some active volcano. And Luke says that they're not lost, and Nick just, from past experience, just goes, okay. Because he knows that if a Jedi straight out said something as simple as that, they can usually be taken at their word. And he says that the other problem is that this whole place is lined with Mount Massive, and he says, you remember what happened over at the Shadow Throne? Any second now, Black Hole's gonna shock the snot out of all of us, and Luke says he won't. And Nick is completely confused. He goes, "What makes you?" And Luke says, "Nick, you worry too much." And he starts using the Force to flow all the Melt Massive, that's the flowing Melt Massive on him, into a sphere ahead of him. Even all the liquefied Melt Massive on the floor. And Luke explains that Black Hole's quote-unquote treatment has left him with some side effects that he probably didn't plan on. And Nick says, "I'm guessing, can you make it into stuff and make it shock people and everything like he does?" Luke shook his head. "I don't think he actually does that stuff either. It's more like he's controlling something and that does it, if you get what I'm saying. Sounds like his style. Doing it himself would be too much like work." Nick nodded at the fallen pawns. "What about these types?" And Luke frowns, and he closes his eyes. And Nick can see something's to Luke, that something's hurting his head maybe, or his heart. And Luke says that they're all dead and he kills them. And we cut over to Cronal, who's letting his consciousness slip from the pawns. He thinks that they outlived their usefulness anyway. And he starts letting his mind slip into the harmonics of the crystalline web along his nerves. And he can touch the structure of the Melt Massive that lines the volcano. And he brings his mind into resonance with the alien slave minds who controlled the rock. And I assume, it's been brought up throughout the book that the Melt Massive is kind of alive. And this does make me wonder, hold on. I thought that was being said in a metaphorical kind of way. Is the Melt Massive actually physically alive? I thought it was like a metaphorical thing. No, maybe it is actually alive. Hopefully it gets a bit more cleared up. And you can feel that these alien slave minds' absolute disbelief at Luke. he can literally he can literally manipulate Mount Massive using only the Force. But Gronal isn't dismayed for some reason. He's actually completely over-delighted, he's overjoyed at this, because he thinks it's a wonderful talent, and it meant that when he took over Skywalker's body, he wouldn't have any more use for the Sunset Crown. And we're talking that with Skywalker's body, with Skywalker's body and his unparalleled connection to the Force, to complement Gronal's unparalleled knowledge of Sith alchemy and the unique properties of Melt Massive, he would indeed rule the galaxy. He could, should he choose, become the galaxy. Every living thing would answer to his will. All that remained was to permanently impose his will upon Skywalker, though the boy had shown an astonishing gift for defying anyone's plans for him, even plans enforced by the incalculable power of Gronal's dark sight, that pesky Jedi training of his. And Gronal reaches out with his dark sight, and he senses another presence very near, and he realises that Luke isn't an only child. It's a power that is untrained, but it's still very powerful. And we come back to Luke, and he's sitting there innocent. Not innocent. He's sitting there frozen. And he's thinking back to his conversation with Nick from earlier, that but he says, they're all innocent. Most of them, some of them are like me. It's been a while since I was innocent of anything. And Nick tries to check for a pulse of a middle-aged woman. And he sighs and knows his head, and explains that there's something growing into their skulls that it's an anti-tamper feature for the crystals and the crowns. And Luke says it's a dead man interlock. And Nick says that about that punch, because again he's the bruise above his right eye, and Luke nods, saying that it must have damaged the interlock, otherwise he would have died outright there on the throne. And Nick asks how Luke would have freed himself if he had died there, and Luke says that he wouldn't have saved himself. 30 minutes it takes for this to turn off. Okay. Sorry. Sometimes the computer screens turn off now after 30 minutes. I know that now. This recording's been going on for 30 minutes, so I know that now. Oh, actually, while I think about it, I only did one chapter yesterday. That was chapter 11. So yeah, I'm now fine. I'm fine. Hopefully, fit the debriefing in on a same day. Anyway, Nick then says that they're lucky that Luke is such a nice guy, and Luke says that maybe they are, but they aren't, as in the pawns, and he didn't help them. And Nick just says that it's not Luke's fault, he didn't bring them here, he didn't modify their brains, and he did everything anyone could. And Luke says, yeah, I'll be sure and explain that to their families. And Nick tries to argue that Black Hole killed them when he put those crystals in their heads. And Luke says that he pitched in and helped him do it. And Nick says, this is a war, Luke. Innocent people get killed. Maybe so, Luke said softly. But they're not supposed to be killed by Jedi. Nick stood. Come on, kids, snap out of it. Like an old friend of mine used to say, the difference between fighting the war and shoveling grasser poop is that in a war, even the guy in charge gets his hands dirty. And Luke looks over at Nick, and Nick sighs and says that it's another old friend of him used to say that his mouth was stuck in hyperdrive, and he explains he was a Jedi too. And Luke is a bit surprised at that, and Nick says that he met only a few and only really knew one. He says, dead now, of course. And he says the way he heard it, Vader killed him personally. And I wonder if that's what was his name? Was it Jax Pavan from Coruscant Nights? Coruscant Nights. I think it's Jax Pavan. Yeah, Jax Pavan. I thought it may have been Jax Pavan. That was the subject of that. I assume he's talking about Jax Pavan, but I could be wrong on that. Coruscant Knights, I've literally got the 4 books there. I know it's technically 3 books and a spiritual successor, but come on, 4 books. And Luke lets his eyes close and says, Vader, you sure? And Nick just says that had to be. Nobody but Vader would have had a chance. And Luke only nods. And he says that he wonders if he's getting used to revelations like this. Or if he still feels like he's in that stone tomb, hanging in the dark, in that darkness at the end of the universe, that he had been in his dream. And he knows he hasn't escaped that. He's just turned it inside out. That darkness is now inside him, the dark. And it's clawing his way back into the dream world, and he looks back at what he'd done and all this stuff. And he thinks that it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter at all. None of this is anyone's fault. As everything suffers for a brief interval, and then tumbles back into the dark, and he thinks about how all that suffering and struggle is for nothing, how everybody's life is a waste, and he thinks, what did it matter if you succeeded beyond your wildest hopes, or if your dreams were shattered and ground to dust? Win or lose, all your triumphs and joys, regrets and fears, and disappointments, all ended as a fading echo trapped within a mound of dead meat. Blame it on the Force. Why should there be life at all? Why does life have to be nothing more than a thin film of pond scum drifting on an infinite sea? Better to have never lived at all than to exist for only a brief moment of struggle and suffering, deluded by the illusion of light. Better to never have lived at all. And then Nick snaps Luke back into it, back to the current moment. And Luke says that he was just thinking, and Nick says, thinking? You were gone, kid. Your lights were on, but there was nobody home. It was scary. Yes, Luke said. For me too. And that's where we end the chapter. The whole dream sequence, it was really weird. I think that's the... But then again, dreams are weird. And, I gave a very brief explanation for that whole sequence. I want to make that very clear. If you really want to experience it, you have to go to chapter 12 yourself. Because it's a really weird a bit of a lengthy sequence as well. Now for me, I was kind of getting annoyed at myself because all different things going on with my... sometimes your ear gets blocked, and I personally like to read just to myself out loud. Very quietly, it's just something like this. So, so I can't sort of mutter what's in the text to myself, and I was annoying myself because my ear was a little bit blocked and noise was a bit muffled and it was like, so I was struggling a bit with the first, I think, 10 pages of this chapter, and this was like 25 pages. Actually, I'm going to put the book back on the shelf. But yeah, I quite enjoy. This was quite an interesting chapter, and I like that we've gone back to the thought-provokingness as well. That's something that we haven't really had since. Oh, I want to say chapter 2 or chapter 3. It's been almost 10 chapters since we've had a chapter like this where it's thought-provoking. And again, it's interesting to see this happen to Luke. It's interesting to see Luke, of all characters, the optimist, be put in a situation like this where he realises that life is kind of meaningless. That existence is kind of meaningless because it's so fleeting. And you see him at the end of this just wondering what's the point of life at all. If it just ends so briefly, if it only exists for a very brief amount of time. And we can't see that reflected in the briefing, where he's really devastated with all the death that he's brought. And this is like only the first of, what was it, like 15,000 or so? Or 50,000 or so? Maybe even more than that he said in the briefing. I can't remember the exact number, but it was a lot. You know, this is only 39 so far. It's only 39 so far. And it's interesting to see how, you know, how Nick, you know, he really tried his best to keep the pawns alive, only for Luke to come flat out prove him wrong and kill them anyway. And you can kind of tell that Nick probably must have also kind of been hitting himself, because it's I've tried my best to keep them alive and you gone and kill them anyway. But yeah, it's a very interesting thing here. Again, the dream sequence, again, it was really weird. It was a bit of a struggle to follow, I think. But I think it's just because it's a dream sequence. It's nothing to do with the terms being used like it usually is in this book. It isn't a problem with the terms itself. It's just a problem with it being a dream. You know, dreams are weird, don't make sense. If anything, that's more of a compliment than to this chapter than something that's meant to put it down. So yeah, it was very weird. It was very weird and a bit difficult to follow. And you know, that's kind of like what dreams are. You know, in the dream everything makes sense, but when you come out of the dream and try to make sense of everything, it just doesn't make sense. And it's kind of like that. It's kind of like looking back at a dream you've just had, and it's a real struggle to make it make sense. It's kind of like that. You know, how Luke is a pebble, but he's holding the pebble, yet he's enclosed by the pebble. You know, it's one of those things that was really a bit all over the place, like a dream. And I think it actually did really well at replicating kind of like what a dream is like. And also very much like seeing how Luke, how it's pretty much implied that Luke would still kind of be there in his body as Chronal controlled it. He wouldn't be fully suppressed. He would still be there to experience what Chronal does. And I like that implication, and how it really does kind of put a massive effect on everything. It really is thought-provoking and interesting, because it's not just Chronal doing this, you know. It's not just Chronal doing this, he's forcing Luke to experience it as well. And it's very interesting to see that. Very interesting. The whole sequence with Nick, you know, with him trying to save Luke, it was interesting. It was interesting to see, a bit fun as well. Nick is a bit comical. I don't think he matches the levels of, say, Ferris Solon or Trevor Flume, or Keats, really, for that matter. Again, if you've watched my Last of the Jedi reviews, you know I really like those characters, especially Keats, really. I really do love Keats. But yeah, it was a very good chapter. Was it a perfect chapter? Like, I'm not sure. Again, I think that's up to debate, and you know, that's fine. It was a good chapter. I enjoyed it, and again, the end was very thought-provoking, because it's, yeah, what is the meaning of life? 42. But yeah, it was very interesting. It was a very interesting chapter, and it was a very interesting end to the chapter as well. And it's going to be interesting to see how that really affects Luke going forward. It's going to be interesting to see how this affects Luke going forward. So yeah, it's also going to be interesting to see what Chronal's going to wind up doing with Leia. It's really going to be interesting to see what that winds up being. So yeah, but I think this brings an end to this review. I'm looking forward to the next chapter. So yeah, and also I kind of just see that the Chronal voice I was doing throughout this review, I was kind of just doing that on the spot. I was kind of doing it on the spot because the thing is, I kind of imagining like the black hole and shadow span voice to be more like this, to be a bit more croaky, a little bit higher. You know, like this. But the Chronal voice to be a bit more like what I was doing earlier, and you know, I'm quite impressed with that actually. Which is funny that I can't imagine the black hole and shadow spawn voice to be like that. When the voice is described as being more like Vader. In that case, you know, that's the complete opposite. But yeah, I really enjoy this. I really did enjoy it, and I'm looking forward to the rest of these chapters. We've only got I've got less than 100. We got a bit more than 160. We got about 162 pages, which, you know, that's not that bad. It's like reading Master of the Jedi Desperate Mission again, but remove 6 pages. So yeah. Well, actually, what was the page count of the Desperate Mission again? I think it was 168. Yeah, it was 168. I wasn't sure if it was 169. But yeah, so it shouldn't be too bad, hopefully. But given we've on, you know, this was chapter 12, we got 13, 14, 15, 16, 17 and 18, 6 more chapters, and they have to cover 162 pages. Oh, I'm not looking forward to these very long chapters that they're going to be. So, yeah. Yeah, I enjoy this chapter. Oh, there's also the debriefing as well, which makes up about 6 pages, I think. So technically, you know what I mean. Anyway, yeah, I enjoy this chapter. I'm looking forward to seeing where this will go. I do think maybe it was a little bit disappointing. I know Luke had to get out of there. You know, I know it wasn't going to be for very long, but it would have been nice to see if Chronal was maybe actually a bit successful with taking Luke's body, if only temporarily. You know, how he thinks it, maybe there was an imperfection with the transfer, and he thinks it's permanent, and what winds up happening is Luke's able to expel him out the body eventually. You know, it would have been interesting to see Chronal actually succeed in taking Luke's body. Of course, with a couple of flaws in the actual takeover. Like, it wouldn't be perfect. Of course, Luke still needs to be able to come back. But, you know, it would have been interesting to see Chronal actually succeed in taking Luke's body. And I think that is probably the one thing that is probably the most disappointing. I was kind of hoping we would get a bit more with Luke, and even just being in the stone with Chronal trying to take... Pardon me. With Chronal trying to take his body. Because for the most part, you know, that was about... We've had about 2 chapters of that. This one and chapter 10. Which only had that at the very end in the last... What was it? Oh, in like the last 5-6 pages of that chapter, of chapter 10. But I do think chapter 10 again... I know we're breaking away from chapter 12 here, but I really did enjoy chapter 10. I think it was a very interesting look into Chronal's backstory, and it makes, again, a very nothing character, the very nothing character that Chronal was, into a very interesting character. So yeah. But anyway, thank you all for watching, and goodbye. Hello everyone. I haven't just read chapter 13 of Luke Skywalker in the Shadows of Mindor. Didn't even have the urge to see Last of the Jedi there. Because I read this about an hour or 2 ago, but I wanted to have a bit of a break before I do the review. simply because I really struggled to get through this chapter, and it's not because it's bad, it's just so long. So it took me a little while to get through it, and I wanted to break after I read it, so now I'm doing the review. So, we're told that night is falling across the Shadow Realm, and we're being told how at the centre of the system the asteroids are going into the star Taspin, which is of course Mindor's star, and of course it's ejecting the flares and bits of plasma, and we're told that it's worse when it's the asteroids with the gravity projectors, because those ones are able to send a vast amount of it. I guess actually I think I'm getting a bit ahead of myself here. Yeah, I'm getting a bit ahead of myself. Yeah, but anyway, the flares are coming, and we're told that that these take down the deflector shields all throughout the system, and the only shields they don't take down is of those of the starfighters making atmospheric attack runs on Shadow Spawn's volcano base, because these shields aren't knocked down. Because it says that these shields were knocked down because of interference from the atmosphere, preventing them from being raised in the first place. And those are the slushies and the other Republic cruisers huddling into the radiation shadow cast by Mindor itself. And night is falling, and we're told again how the atmosphere is interfering with the lasers. They pretty much don't do anything more than like a punch. Meanwhile, the turbo lasers, which are incredibly sophisticated now, they've been increasingly improved since the Battle of Yavin, and now still just as steadily as they would be without the atmosphere. And we're told that against the next X-Wing, who goes straight for more than a second, gets blasted, and even a glancing blow from that is enough to send the X-Wing into a ball of plasma. And the X-Wings keep coming on, and there's just so many that there's just so many fighters flying around that you have to kind of slow down to avoid getting hit, and if you do that, then of course the turbo laser locks onto you, so you can't really slow down, you can't really keep going fast, it's kind of a death trap whatever way you think go about it. And we're told about how the steel X-Wings came on in wave after wave, pilots giving their lives to shield flights of B-Wing bombers that swooped in for torpedo runs. The B-Wings went after the towers. They focused their fire on 6 heavily armoured domes atop the highest curve of the volcano. We're told there's one dome which houses in the centre, which houses the gravity gun, and the other 5 domes surrounding it have the ion cannon turbo lasers. I think that's what they were, wasn't it? Yeah, ion turbo cannons. And the B-Wings are barely even leaving dents against them. It's just, again, the atmosphere is having too much interference, and we're told that and they also can't really, and they're not really going to open up. They have to keep bombarding all these domes to keep them from activating the ion cannons or the gravity gun. And just about once night falls, every Republic capital ship in the system. It says, and once night fell across the battle, every Republic capital ship in the system, clustered in the planetary shadow, shields from the ejector bursts, will be in its field of fire, as in the gravity gun. And We're told. Hang on, I've just missed a bit. It says, inside those armoured domes were the base's planetary defence weapons. The 5 smaller domes surrounding the vast central dome contain dual-mounted ground-to-orbit ion turbo cannons. The twin-mounted barrels will fire on a precisely timed interval, ensuring that a strike from the ion cannon would disable the capital ship's shields and electronics will be followed instantly by a disintegrating blast from the turbo laser. Those were deadly enough in themselves, but the central dome housed the weapon against which no ship of the line could defend, the gravity gun. And once night fell across the battle, every Republic capital ship in the system, clustered in the planetary shadow to shield from the ejector bursts, would be in its field of fire. This was not their only problem. And we're told about how the asteroids falling into Taspon, the ones with gravity stations, create an even bigger flares and plasma bursts. And one of these just glances at Mindor. It just glances its atmosphere, but it's enough to ignite the atmosphere and cause a whirlwind of fiery smoke and dust that makes its way over to the base, and everyone has to ground because they won't be able to see. And so, I mean, how chaotic it is, you would just crash into everyone if you kept fighting. So they have to stop, and everyone has to land. But it was also pointed out. It would also, as was pointed out to Lando Calrissian by Fen Sheezer, force the domes to remain closed over the surface to orbit weapons, as well as temporarily overload the heat exchangers that cooled the turbo lasers in the rings of the tower. And if you don't mind me bringing it up, General, Sheezer had gone on, maybe the only tactical error this Shadow Spawn character has made so far is that he's clustered all his planetary defence weapons together, right on top of that big hill. Lando had nodded. Easier to defend. That they are, Sheezer had agreed, even if it's not them defending them. You follow? Lando had considered this for a moment. Only a moment. He had never been slow to jump on an opponent's weakness. Then, my friend, he'd said slowly, have I told you today how much I admire the way you think? And, they start sending out, the capital ships go lower down to the ground and send off landers. 2 of them send off landers that go on top of the volcano dome. And the remember Alderaan. The 2 sends off landers around the ion turbo bow cannons. And the remember Alderaan sends its landers to the place. Pardon me. To go to the gravity gun, and for a moment the battle's contained by the raging firestorm, and the overheated turbo lasers can't fire. Starfighters are on the ground. I just went a few pages. That's not good. Pages stuck together. And the domes can't be opened, otherwise, suffer damage. And no ground forces can leave either, because again, it's literally a whirlwind of fire out there. But the storm doesn't last long, and in minutes, the storm gathers up as much as it can, and the dust starts picking up, winds up actually killing the storm. And once it's down, everything is still glowing hot. Everything comes back online. Everyone starts fighting again. And we cut over to Group Captain Click and his company of elite commandos who have made their way to the sorting centre. And it feels like there's some low-level ground quakes, which are just earthquakes going on. The base is shuddering, and all the all the people in there are a bit scared, and Click tells them to go down on the floor, face down on the floor, and now. And he says to the sergeant to take the second platoon and shoot any prisoner still on his or her or its feet 5 seconds from now. And he says, the rest of you on me. And he leads them through to the election centre's door. And he orders the 4th platoon front and centre. And he steps to one side and orders for the door to be sealed and that to let no one in or out. And he says, 1st platoon, fire in position in support of 4. The rest of you prepared to repel assault. And they start stealing off the door through foam blast, which is usually used on environment suits, but it permanently seals the door in place. And not a moment too soon, because they start hearing the door servos as someone tries to open it from behind. And Greek orders everyone to get back and to prepare to fire on his order. And some of the front leading ones go prone, the ones behind them kneel, and of course the others behind stand. And Glick thinks how there's only one way to get through a foam blasted door, which is a breaching charge. And then no explosion comes through. And just when Click begins to wonder if he'd imagined the servo wine, he sees the dual seal door begin to glow. And then eventually it glows so hot it bursts open, and there's a green laser there. And Click thinks, alright, 2 ways through a foam blast seal door. Breaching charge and lightsaber. And he notices it's a green lightsaber. And then he has a terrible premonition, and he orders his troopers to hold fire, and if anybody shoots before his order, he'll kill them himself. And the lightsaber cuts through the door, and Luke and Nick step through, and Click doesn't give the order to fire, he just simply stands, just staring, awestruck beyond words. Click realises who Luke is, and his mouth goes dry. His mouth goes dry, and he just kneels and says, Emperor Skywalker. And he orders, and he takes off his helmet, and he orders his other troopers to kneel and take their helmets off to kneel to their Emperor. And he goes, your pardon, my lord, I did not know you. We cut back to the battle where the Republic Marines are now... We cut over to the Republic Marines on top of the volcano dome. And this part of the battle was really complicated. It got a bit confusing. It was fine at first, but then it got confusing and it was a bit of a struggle to try and follow later. But it's a battle between the Marines and, of course, the Shadow Troopers. And there's the Landers, getting in the battle. The Shadow Troopers have, what was it? It was in like hover tanks. And the Stormtroopers are going in hand-to-hand combat, and usually people are intimidated by their vibro-knucklers, but the Marines aren't, because they favour for close combat 18cm AK RAB clip points vibro daggers that can cut Mark III armour like a Render's Gorgon blubber. That's what it says in the book. And around the dome that houses the gravity gun, 12 Landers from the member Alderaan have come down in a double wing, and we're told that 4 close in around the placements with the other 4 encircling. Oh, okay, now I realise the Landers are again the ships. That's why I was confused. I thought it was the Marines. But they go around the gravity gun emplacement, and again, and they can't really get shot at yet without harming the barracks, without harming the bunkers. And the Blacks and the Shadow Troopers come swarming out of the bunkers. using the inner landers to as cover from the fire of the surrounding eight, while they go to work on the hulls with fusion torches and shape blast breaching charges. Now it's all that if any stormtroopers found it odd that the 12 landers, unlike the ones around the Ion turbo emplacements, just remain tightly sealed instead of releasing their marines. None remarks on it. But the unusual tactic for this was explained when one of the stormtrooper officers was able to get in, saw nothing in there, only explosives in there, and it blows up all of the landers, at least all of the inner landers out properly, and another black armoured stormtrooper, and that's when all the infantry starts flooding out, and another stormtrooper in a black armoured stormtrooper in the bunkers sees them, and he says, "Fall back, barricade the corridors, hold the corners and crossways." Because we're told that it says because the last thing this officer wanted to do was race his men by going head to head against Mandalorians. Then we cut back. No. Then we cut over to Han, Leia and Chewie, who are in, of course, the tunnels. Han is still incredibly depressed about the Falcon being taken from him, and he's thinking about how someone's got their grubby hands on his controls. And Chewie says a couple of things to him. And agrees with his anger, and he gestures ahead to Leia, who's quite far ahead, and Han frowns, and we're told that Leia had given up trying to talk to him after a couple of minutes, and he says, I think she's mad at me. You think she's mad at me? It's not my fault, Han scowled. It seemed like he said that too often. It's not my fault. I warned her, didn't I? Didn't I warn her that we'd be sorry for rescuing those scumballs? And R2 whistles, and Han has a pretty good idea of what he means. And Han says that he's not sorry about finding him, and that's not what he meant. And he says that, man, she's really upset her. And Chewbacca says something that we don't learn just yet. And Han brightens a bit and goes, really, you think? And Chewie grumbles a bit more and waves Han on, and Han goes, maybe alright, stay here with the droids, and he runs after Leia. And she says that, and he says that he needs to check her shoulder, and Leia says that there's no time. And Han says that she says that like that she knows where they're going, and Leia says that she kind of knows where they're going, and she says that way. And Han only sees darkness and asks what it is, and Leia says that that's the way Luke is. And Han asks if she's sure, and Leia tells him without looking at him that she's sure. And Han says that he guesses so, and he says that this Force stuff, he says it's, it's one thing to see Luke do it, but what? Now she did stop, and she looks at him. From the flash her eyes picked up off the glow rod, he kind of wished he'd been smart enough about 15 seconds ago to bite his tongue in half. It's just that you and I. I'm sorry, I make you uncomfortable, General Solo, she said tartly. I suppose you'd be better off with someone like, well, fuse my bus bars, Han said. Chewie was right, you are jealous. And, Leia asks what Aona had said, and Han tells her to go easy, and to calm down. And she says that she's not jealous, she's angry, and that Aona took Han completely off guard. And Han flinches and says, not completely. And Leia says, you think she would have caught you flat-footed if she wasn't good looking? And Han says, maybe not, but I am pretty sure that if she wasn't good looking, you wouldn't have hit her so hard. Hope I broke her nose, Leia mutters darkly. Then suddenly answered his screen and added a little chuckle. Fuse my bus bars? Really? And Han shrugs and says it's just an expression he's trying out, because when he gets too old to be dashing, he'll have to be colourful. And and Leia tells him that he's already colourful and he'll always be dashing, and says that she takes the fun out of everything. And then there's a burst of static, and it's Lando, and Lando's of course completely confused because he thinks the one in the Falcon is Han, and Han's confused about Lando being in the battle. And Lando tells him, Han, that was Hobby you just clipped. He's going down. Again. Ceasefire. And he tells him to get out of the battle. And Lando tells him that if he doesn't stand down, they'll have to take him down. And Han tells him that it's not them in there. And Mendo goes, great, Rogue Leader, light her up. Don't do it, Wedge, don't you dare shoot down my ship. Don't you mean my ship, Lando said. Should have known it wasn't you. Flies like a bantha in a tar pit. And he describes how harm flies. And tells him that he's serious, and if he puts one scratch on the Falcon, Lando finishes for him, saying he'll never find it under all the dents. And he says if he can just... And Lando says if Wedge can just take out the thrusters. And Han grimaces. The goal ends. And Leia notes that there's something wrong here. And Han cycles through things as to what could be wrong, and Leia says, not so much. It's more we've been running in the dark through a cave and we haven't fallen down the whole thing. What? R2, she called back along the tunnel. Do an environmental scan and analysis. I think these caves aren't natural. Something made this. Han looks around and froze in place. You mean, he said slowly, some kind of rock-looking critters that can, melt themselves out of the walls and floors and stuff? I don't know. Maybe. She stops and looks back at Han, who was surrounded by rock-looking critters that appeared to have melted themselves out of the walls and floor. Good call, Han said, and then the floor opened beneath him, and he dropped out of sight. And Leia rings forward and calls out a Han, but then she falls into the darkness. And we cut back to Luke with Click and Nick. Click and Nick. Click is talking to Luke about how much he about his unlikely story and how much he and Luke kind of didn't really listen, and he stopped listening after Click started talking about how much of a masterpiece he found Luke Skywalker: The Jedi's Revenge to be, and Luke thinks another blasted fan of that blasted show. And who'd have thought that so much damage could be done by one stupid story? And Click says this was the objective of his entire great cause, to rescue you from the evil rebellion and restore you to your rightful throne. And Luke says not exactly him, and Click is a bit confused, of course, because this isn't Chronal in Luke's body, so Chronal isn't able to play it off the way he would have. And Luke asks who the people in the room are, and Click says that they're no one of consequence. They're rebel captives bound for the slave pits, and not to concern himself. And Luke thinks that that's just all he needs, more people he can't save. And he asks how many slaves they have, and Click says that they have too many, several thousands, and they're even on starvation rations. They can barely keep them fed, and the water situation. And Luke says that he gets it, and he looks over to Nick, who only shrugs, and he says, "Don't look at me," Nick said. "I'm not the Emperor." And darkness closes like a fist around Luke's heart, and he stands in the doorway and looks at the looks at the vast cavern of gleaming black, because it's black. It's a gleaming black cavern, and we're told it seems to be filled with stormtroopers in the armour that matches the stone, kneeling to him with their helmets uncovered. And we're told that there's hundreds upon hundreds of other people, regular people, and we're told that their only crime was living on planets that Black Hole decided to invade. And they're afraid to even lift their heads up. And he says, "I'm the Emperor Dooley," and wonders what's wrong with him. And he thinks, had this not been, after all, his father's plan for him, Vader's plan, maybe Vader had understood fully a truth that Anakin Skywalker had only glimpsed. That all striving comes to nothing in the end. That the only answer was to take what you could get, to rule at ease, to enjoy whatever fragmentary instance of pleasure one's brief life might offer. What difference did it make? Heroes, villains, kings and peasants all went to the same final dark. Why struggle? He didn't have an answer. He remembered answers he's gotten from Ben and from Yoda, even from Uncle Owen and Aunt Beru. Empty talk of duty and tradition, of honour and love, but none of them had understood. Not really. Or maybe they had. Because what was that talk of duty and honour and love really? Wasn't it just their way of controlling him? And Click asks if Luke is unwell. And Luke looks over to Nick and asks if it happens again. And Nick tells him that it did. And Luke tells him that he did something to me. And he can't fight it. And Click asks who did something to him. He's now on his feet. And he says to name this traitor, and both him and his men will destroy him. And Luke has to tell him that they're not going to be destroying anybody. There's been too much destroying. And another shake goes through the cavern. And Nick says, "Yeah, no kidding, and these guys can help us stop it." "No. Skywalker, think about it," Nick began. "I can't," Luke says. "I can't think about it. That's what you don't understand. Thinking about it will send me away again. Back into the..." His voice trailed off. He couldn't make himself talk about the dark. Talking about it would break the surface film of light that was all that stood between him and the unbearable truth. It would rupture the illusion. That was the only thing that kept him going right now. That was the only thing keeping him going right now. I have to pretend to trust what I've always known. I have to act like I believe it's all still true. That they weren't all lying to me. That I wasn't just kidding myself. Do you get it?" No, not really." Luke lips, fitted blue eyes, shaded grey with growing concern. "Not really at all." And Luke tells him to just take his words for it. And Luke has to tell himself to just pretend like what all he knew and to act like these were lives that were worth saving, and perhaps if he pretends for long enough, he can fall back into the dream of light. And he says and he gives Click new orders. Which is to take care of everyone, and Nick misinterprets that as kill everyone, and Luke says that no, get them food and water. He wants them to care for them, tend their wounds, make them safe. And Click doesn't really understand, but he says yes, and Luke tells him to send their men, not just these people, but the men he commands, and send them all to attend to the slaves, and all of them. And Click they want them to withdraw from the battle, and Luke says it's not a battle, it's a mistake and misunderstanding. And Click is completely confused and baffled at this, but Luke tells him to round up all the slaves, protect them, as long as they have them organised and secure, and then turn themselves over to the Republic. And as soon as they have them organised and secure, to turn them and themselves to the Republic, and cooperate in every way with the Republic military, including assisting them in battle. And Nick is completely baffled at this, and he It tells you to have aid and comfort to the give aid and comfort to the enemy. No, they're not your enemy, not anymore. Do you understand? From this point forward, you and your men are to consider yourselves part of the Republic military. Do not fail me, Group Captain. My Lord Emperor. The Group Captain's eyes glazed, but the discipline of obedience was absolute. My lord, we will not fail. Very well, Luke said. You have your orders. And Nick starts to realise what it says. Okay, sure, Skywalker, I get it, but what now? And Luke doesn't know what. And he shakes his head and he explains that he feels like he's still inside the stone, except the stone is in him. And Nick says, "Oh, that makes sense." Nick asks what Cronal did to him, and Luke says that he infected him. And of course, Nick is thinking more in the more real realm, but Luke says that no, he infected him with the truth, and that reality, and that it's all a joke, not even a funny one, just a pointless, stupid waste, a spark of suffering extinguished to eternal nothingness. You can see that Nick doesn't understand, and that he couldn't really understand, because how can Luke explain what the dark was? And he just wonders how he could explain how the illusions that came from being raised by loving parents, as it says, and to believe in the ideals of who believed in the ideals of the Old Republic, and that the Jedi weren't the real heroes, and instead hidebound, ruthless enforcers of the will of the Republic's rulers. He wonders just how he could explain the cruelty of the universe. Stand with your arms restrained by stormtroopers and watch as the Death Star destroys your homeworld for no real reason at all. And then he realises that that the flash he just had wasn't a memory, it was a vision of the future. And he realises that Cronal, it's not him hanging in the dark at the end of the universe, it's the Leia hanging in the dark at the end of the universe. And Nick asks, and Luke says, "It's Leia, my sister." And Nick is surprised and says that you have a sister, and Luke nods and says that black holes found her. And we cut over to Chewie and R2 falling through the darkness, and R2's making a scan of everything, and he can tell that the rock looks like it's thinking, with a bunch of distinct minds, and it's something that R2 would like to investigate more thoroughly, but he's too focused on making sure he has a safe landing so he doesn't further damage his locomotor. And eventually R2 lands on top of Chewie, which even makes him wheeze for breath because of how hard he lands, and he shoves himself off Chewbacca onto the floor. And he can see there's human visible lights, but the lights swinging a bit too swiftly, and R2 notices that R2 has to switch to his previous EM sensor band to make sense of the situation, and you can see the light source is Han swinging the glow rods to shoo back some vaguely humanoid shapes. And he says that, "Back off, I'll bash any one of you who takes one more step. Back off." And R2 assumes that Solo is either highly agitated or speaking in the confusing idiomatic human code that C-3PO referred to as metaphor, because it was certainly clear to R2's sensors at any rate that these humanoid shapes to which he spoke did not actually have legs, much less feet, and thus were already certain, regardless of threat or instruction, never to take one more step. And R2 figures out that these humanoid shapes aren't actually creatures at all, at least not as his programming understood them. They're nominally humanoid, but they generally look humanoid, not necessarily humanoid, and they seem to grow up from the cavern itself. They move like they're controlled by some sort of consciousness, and we're told that they exhibit a peculiar electromagnetic field signature that R2 had noted during his descent, and a quick scan of his starter files for any reference of this minimal life form comes up blank. Except for something he stored in his short-term cache because he had no internal reference to guide him and choose him where to file it. And again, it's that recording of Aona Cantor talking about how they'll steal the ship, where one of her companions asks what they should do, which is if whoever shows up isn't a Jedi, then we take their stuff and leave them to the melters. And R2 thinks that this must be those melters. And he makes a new file, which is Mindor mineral life form, motile, and melters. And throughout this entire process only takes 0.674 of a standard second, to which R2 has plenty of time to do a self-systems check. Meanwhile, Chewbacca gets to his feet to assist Han and Leia against fighting off the melters, and there was an astonished howl of pain when Flesh and Bone Wookiee Fist met the smelter head. This is followed by blue crackling energy that hits Chewie, and then another one when he lands onto a melter, and Chewie falls to the floor unconscious, and Han shouts out Chewie, and he throws himself against the massive melters, which sends more bursts of that same energy. And Leia calls out with the same distress. And she leaps toward the melters, and in the 0.384 seconds she was actually in the air, R2 calls upon an array of highly specialised sub-processors that had originally been installed as a customised aftermarket modification by the Royal Engineers in Naboo, and later extensively refitted and programs with a very specific set of behaviours by a particularly gifted tinkerer who's had in his day a justified reputation as the finest self-taught improvisational engineering the galaxy had ever produced, Anakin Skywalker. And R2 flies through the air directly to the master melters, which is with his anti-tamper field, which sizzles to life, and has a loud crackle of discharge crackle, due to the great drain on his power supply, on his internal power supply. And it's able to calculate that it's operating at triple strength, the anti-tamper field, which is beyond what its theoretical limit. And it says owing to its potential lethal effects. And R2 also notes that whenever a melter reaches for him with a pseudo-arm, the touch of his triple strength and anti-tamper field instantly liquefies them, the electrocrystalline structure of the melter-lined stone body, as well as the four melters nearest to it. And with his best interpretation of a Wookiee bat war whoop, R2 wades his way into the melters. He tries to spark them to slag on every side, and it's told that as long as he has a remaining urge in his energy supply, he would allow no harm to come to Leia. But there is one flaw in this determination, which is he already has a very low energy output, so this doesn't turn out to be a metaphor, but an actual thing. And the last couple of lines are, for a brief flicker of a millisecond, and the last two lines are, he did however note one particular flaw in this determination, which was that his level of energy output had already outstripped the self-regeneration capacity of his energy supply, and so that single remaining urge situation, as C-3PO might say, was no mere metaphor, and the walls and the floor just kept on humping into lumps that would become new melters. For a brief flicker of a millisecond, R2-D2 experienced a power spike in a tiny audio loop in one specific memory core. He heard C-3PO's voice exclaim, "We're doomed!" which I'm fairly sure is from A New Hope. And that's where we end the chapter. Again, this was 25 pages. You know, this recording's not almost 40 minutes. I think this is probably one of the few times the battle segments have actually been good. They're actually quite good this chapter. Until about the Mandalorian parts, which I was struggling to follow by the time it kept reading up the landers, I only actually started to understand it during this summary. So yeah. I think the most interesting thing, it relates to Luke, who is, he's really struggling with the truth that Chronals brought to him, which is the way of the dark, how destruction is inevitable and the only permanent thing. And you see how he's struggling with that truth, how he's trying to ward it off, but he just can't. And how he realises that Leia is the target. Pardon me. How Leia is the target. Is the new target. And that Leia was the one he was seeing in his future. In the future. At the end of the universe. Which I was a bit surprised to, actually. And I suppose it would also kind of work for Chronal. Leia, she's highly influential in this point of time. She's a major figure in the New Republic. He can kind of infiltrate the New Republic that way. So yeah, it's going to be interesting to see where that all leads to. It's interesting to see how Luke is really struggling with the truth of the dark. Which again, it's tough to argue against the way of the dark. It's tough to argue because so much of what it says is true. So much of what it was is true. So it's really tough to make an argument against the dark when a lot of what it says is truth. And it's very interesting about that. So yeah, it's very interesting. Again with Luke, with how he's struggling again with the dark. It's interesting to see a character like him who's usually so hopeful, so willing to save literally anyone, starting to get that feeling of such defeat here, and also that feeling of what is the purpose of what he does. And depending on how this book ends, if this book was canonized, and maybe even put a little bit later into the canon timeline, I think you could very well have had a very reasonable explanation for why Luke is the way he is in Last Jedi. Which, I personally enjoy the sequels. I don't think they're perfect, but I enjoyed them. But even I can say that Luke Skywalker was not really done well in Last Jedi. I know even Mark Hamill, he has to imagine that he lost his when they was doing the filming. He had to bring his own idea for what happened to Luke, where he lost his wife and child. And that's why Luke's the way he is in the Last Jedi, because that's the only thing he thinks could have brought that Luke that far. But I think this is also a very good idea for that as well. Also do find it quite funny with Click, how he's how he's starts geeking out at Luke. And also, you can just kind of imagine how frustrated Chronal's going to kind of be at this, because now he's kind of lost the command of all his forces. He's kind of just lost command of all his forces to Luke. And he's not in control of Luke either. He's not in control of Luke in the slightest. So, he can't play it off the way he was hoping to. So, Cronal's really not probably going to be happy about this. Even though he's going after Leia now, he's still probably not going to be happy about this. And he's just at losing his entire, or at losing everyone. That was under his command. He's so carefully planned this and so carefully done this. And it's starting to all go wrong. It's quite comical actually. The moment between Han and Leia, where Leia was a bit angry or maybe even jealous, that was quite nice. And it was quite nice to see them be a bit more in a relationship. If there has been anything in this book, it just does feel Leia is a bit almost childish in this book. I can't been getting the feeling that she's a bit childish in this book. I just for some reason getting that feeling from her. I just feel that way about her in this book. There's something about her that just doesn't feel right. And even in this chapter, it still feels like that. And I think the conversation between Han and Leia about the jealousy is probably the most mature they've probably had. Conversation they've had. The most mature Leia's feels like she's been in this book. Because the rest of the time she just feels quite childish for some reason. Again, that might just be Leia's character. There's just something about this that it feels almost like a childish rebelliousness rather than Leia's rebelliousness. Because Leia, she is a very she doesn't really take much nonsense. She is a very rebellious, but the way it's done in this book just feels a bit childish when it comes to that. And I think that's one thing about Leia in this book that I haven't really enjoyed much. It's just the way she's been characterised. It just feels quite childish. Even with Luke, with him, if it was him doing all this trying to sense everything, it feels like it would have been done in a much more mature way. Whereas for Leia, it just feels like he's near, sort of, and a lot of the things just feel very childish, and it still carries over in this chapter. But at least in this chapter, Leia and Han have that moment where she's talking about fuse my bus bars, really. And they have that moment between each other where it's when I get older, and now it's you'll always be dashing no matter how old you get, and you're already colourful. That's probably the most mature. It feels almost mature exchange. I think it feels maybe even in character exchange between the two of them that there have been so far. Or exchange with Leia in the book so far. There's just something about Leia that doesn't feel right in this book. If there is anything, it is that if there is another problem I have with the book, it is just Leia's characterisation. Something just doesn't feel right about it. For some reason. I don't know what it is, but it just doesn't feel right. We also learned what the melters were, though I did kind of spoil myself on the melters. Literally one chapter before. I finished chapter 13 and then I spoiled myself on the melters. It's not the worst thing. Not the worst thing at all. I think they're a neat idea, but we kind of need to know a little bit more about them. Which I hope we'll get. I think we'll get. Yeah. But I think that for now, this brings an end to this review. There was another thing, which is I really do like how hopeless this battle seems for the New Republic. It really... Sorry, I keep burping. It really is how are they going to win this? Because it feels like everything that can go wrong is going wrong for them. So it's really interesting to see how it's going to be, how they win this. It's really is, how do they win this? Just how? How? So yeah, no, but that brings an end to this review. So thank you all for watching, and goodbye. Hello, so I've just read chapter 14 of Luke Skywalker and the Shadows of Mindor. Almost wanted to say Last of the Jedi again. I think I'm just going to have to cut this down to one chapter a day. These chapters are getting really long now. Too long for me to really be able to fit 2 in now without really starting to get tired. So we open up with Nick and Luke, who are still in the volcano base, running down a corridor. And Nick is struggling to keep up, and he tells Luke to take it easy, and Luke tells him there's no time because Black Hole needs somebody who can use the Force, and Leia's just as strong as he is, and well, she doesn't have his training, and once Gronal gets his paws on her and he doesn't finish, and he stops and he says to Nick that he won't let that happen. He says, "That's all, I won't, no matter what I have to do." And Nick just goes, "Gee kids, 2 minutes ago things were going pretty good and I could barely get you to talk. Now everything's going wrong and you're making the jump to light speed without bothering to board a ship." "Yeah, funny how that works," Luke says. "I guess I can handle things going wrong in the world. I'm used to it. I can do something about it. When things go wrong in here, that's where the problem is." And Nick says something about the crystals. And Luke is unsure, and he says that all he knows is that it makes him want to just stop. He initially says die, but he thinks no, just stop. And Luke continues running on. And Nick just wants to stop for a moment and to catch his breath, and Luke just tells him, "You want to stay here? Go ahead, I'm sure Black Hole will be happy to make you another crown." And they continue running, and even though Nick's memory's still a bit hazy from when he's been shadow spawned, but he remembers enough, and he says to Luke that that's not the way out of there. And Luke doesn't even slow, and he says it's because they're not leaving. He came here to put a stop to all this. And even before he knew what was going on, and now that he knows, he's not going anywhere till it's over. And Nick asks over how, and Luke just says however. And Nick pretty much talks about how this reminds him of Anakin. And they have a bit of a conversation about Anakin. And Luke says that he was told he favoured his mother. And he asks Nick a bit about Anakin, and he learns that everyone thinks that Anakin died in the temple protecting Padawans. And Luke says that he is the last of the Jedi, and he was trained by Ben Kenobi. Nick Straws drops and says, "You mean Obi-Wan? I thought that was, just more hollow thriller gunk. Kenobi's alive?" "No," Luke said softly. "Who are you?" "Me? Nobody. Nobody's special." And Nick explains he was an officer in the Grand Army of the Republic, and he didn't get along real well with most recent management. And Luke asks what he's been up to for the past 25 years. And Nick says he's been hiding from Vader, and that was the management. And Luke tells him that Vader's dead, and the Emperor died on the same day as him. And Nick goes, "What's just like in the show? That's good news." And he asks if Luke killed them. But he tells him that no, he didn't kill either of them. And Luke says, and Nick goes, "Not exactly like in Luke Skywalker and the Jedi's Revenger." "No," Luke said even more softly, "not like that at all. But they are dead. That part's true." And they make their way. They hear more shockwaves, and they continue running, and Nick just wants to stop for a moment and relax for a little bit. But Luke has to keep on But they keep on moving, and they make their way to a narrow ledge. Sorry, just by in the night. And there's a caldera below. And they can see the volcano base and the battle below, I think, as well. And Luke says that they're going to have to make their way down here. Nick down there, and he points to some point, and Nick goes, "Have I mentioned that I've got, a minor issue about heights?" And Luke says he's sorry about that, but he has a feeling he'll need Nick. And Nick tries to argue that if Luke's going after his sister, someone will need to take Chronal, and that he can kind of feel where he is, and he can find him and take him out. And Luke tells him that no, just no, and that's final. And Nick tries to argue maybe the only way to save Leia, but Luke says, and what happens if he gets to her before you get to him? What happens if she doesn't have somebody like you around to break her out of the treatment the way you saved me? And Nick sees the problem, and then they see the Millennium Falcon fly overhead, and Luke is able to kind of guide it into a like a big mound of cinders, and it gets stuck in a 60-degree angle. And Nick learns that Han Solo isn't a fictional character, and Luke says that this isn't his best trick, and Nick goes, did you just now catch that ship? Not exactly. Luke opened his eyes. Not exactly. And that's not your best trick? Nick shook his head, blinking. What is your best trick? I hope you never find out, Luke said. Come on. And we cut over to Leia, and she's fighting even harder now that now that Han and Chewie are out the battle, and she sees R2 fly in as well, and she calls for R2 to throw the holdout, which is through the same compartments which R2 gave Luke his lightsaber. So yeah. I was told that that ejector has only been engineered less than the year before, but I'm fairly sure that was something that got retconned in the 2008 Clone Wars. Because I'm fairly sure there are probably some scenes in that show that have, Anakin using it. I'm fairly sure there are. I have a kind of faint memory of them. But, that's another thing about that 2008 Clone Wars. Mike just has so many retcons in there, but anyway. R2 throws out a ELG-5C holdout blaster made by Sorrow Sub for Leia, and it's funny because didn't Leia have Aona's KYD-21 -21? It's a bit like well, it's not the word, maybe she lost it in the fall. And Leia starts liquefying all of them with the sunblast, and she tries to wait, and she tells R2 to get Chewie and try to wake him up, and to get them up and get in behind her, and she's also dragging Han, and she tries to wake Han up, and she gives him a couple sharp smacks, which only gets a thing grown from him, and she winds up having to pinch his earlobe and really dig her nail in, which winds up waking Han up, and he asks if where his blaster is, and he sees it up ahead after Leia shoots down a couple, and he gets it, and he starts opening fire as well, and and Han requests for a bit of light from R2, and R2 turns on his hollow projector to give them some light. And they got to keep backing up. And eventually Chewie gets up, and he grabs R2, and the four of them start making a run for it. Well, Han, Leia, and Chewie make a run for it. R2 gets carried by Chewie, and they keep running through the tunnel. They make their way to a large cavern, and they realise that, oh, this is where the Melters want them to be, because they look around and they see a bunch of dead bodies in there. Some fresh, some old, and they realise that this is where the Melters wanted them to be. And we cut over to the battle again with the battle, which this confused me because it's made it seem like in the last chapter the capital ships were already in the atmosphere, but here we're told that they're in space. So that kind of confused me. I was under the impression they were already there. But anyway, there are a lot of kind of suicide runs happening, and it's really starting to hurt. Remember, all they've lost a good amount of stuff, and Lando is asking where their fighter escort is, but he knows they're already having to expend so many forces. And he goes over to his executive officer, Cartil, who's a glass Theron, who has 3 expressionless eyes. He tells him they need to close the fleet up and bring the ships closer together. And Cartil tries to argue that they're already as close as they are. But Han tells him that, not Han, Lando says that, they need to bring it as close as possible. And he moves over to the communications board and asks if there's anything from Shisa. And he tries to communicate to Fen, saying that they're only 8 minutes off the gravity gun's firing window, and they got a whole lot of ships with their bellies hanging out up here. And Shisa comes in and he says that they're making progress but slowly. They're going to have to go through. They're going room to room, and the black and the shadow troopers are the shadow trooper types. It says these black armor types are dug in and they don't seem to believe in running away. Do they believe in dying? That they have a talent for. Problem is they keep trying to take our boys with them when they go. And Lando says to keep it all up, and and he'll see if he can send help for them. Also earlier, 3PO got stuck under I think it was a security console. And Calrissian told it orders for 3PO to be helped, because otherwise they would just drive everyone nuts by calling for help. And the communication between Fen and Lando ends, and 3PO keeps trying to insist to Lando that he has something that might be interesting, and Lando says to open a channel with Wedge, and he has 10 seconds, and 3PO of course starts blabbering unnecessary stuff, and he says, well, you may find it interesting, I can't know for certain, but interesting or not, it's unquestionably significant. In my opinion, that is. Your opinion? General Captain Antilles, the officer said. Please, General Calrissian, my opinion on this matter is most reliable. Lost your chance. And Lando tells Reg that the Mandos are struggling, and he wants them to and he tells him that if that dome opens up, he wants more ordnance going in than coming out. And he asks if they reads, and Reg says that yes, but he's down 3 birds, and he asks if they've got a squadron or 2 to spare. And Lando says to not make jokes, and lives are depending on them. And that Reg goes off, and 3PO tries to keep on keeps to try to tell Calrissian something. And Lando says to Cartil to alert the fleet they're going atmospheric, and all 3 of the exec's eyes blink at once, and he goes, sir. And Lando says that he heard him, and that if they're still in orbit 10 minutes from now, the STOEs, which was the well, what was it? The I'll come back too far. Surface to orbit emplacements. They can cut them to pieces, and he asks where they're gonna land, and Lando says that they'll worry about that once they're out their firing window. And 3PO says that finally he's able to get a word in and get Lando's attention by saying that he has something he says by saying he thought he wanted to find Han. And he explains that within there is Lando's brief communication. There, he could pick up some kind of background noise, and that there was a subtle modulation in the. He says, "Yes, General. Yes, that's it precisely. During that communication, I detected a subtle modulation in the carrier waves, sort of a background noise, one might say." What kind of background noise? It appears to be a retrograde orthodialect of Sermo-Clarithian electro-speech interspersed with a Creole of the Black Dwarf variant of Imperial Digital Encryption and the Nemoidian Trade cipher. Fascinating, really, especially in the structural vocabulation 3PO. Oh yes, of course. Essentially, something was speaking in the comm wave, or rather the comm signal was picking up something's speech. Another comm signal? Oh, no, no, no. Nothing so sophisticated. It's simply a language. Electro-speech is a type of direct energy modulation used by a variety of life forms. To date, I believe the total known to science numbers over. Forget that. This electro-speech. You understand it? The droid drew himself up proudly. I am fluent in over 6 million forms, so I don't need a list. What's it say? And 3PO says the accent is perfectly barbarous, and they were talking about taking a pair of humans captive and deliver them to their crypt chamber. And Lando says, crypt chamber, who's taking them? What crypt chamber and who's taking them captive? And 3PO says that he can't say who the captors might be. The language be appropriate for any number of energy-based life forms. And Lando asks why 3PO is wasting his time with this, and 3PO says it's because the two captives were apparently accompanied by a Wookiee. And they also mention a droid that very much matches R2's design, and he says that, oh, they need to help R2. And Lando says, all right, slow down. And he realises that if whoever has R2, they might have Luke, or know what happened to him, and that's what Lando tells himself anyway. It makes him better to give him, and he feels better to have at least a theoretically valid argument, pardon me, of military necessity for the rescue mission, because he was already going to send the order. He was pretty sure he was going to send the order anyway. And he asks how the signal punched through in the first place. And 3PO says, that's exactly the point, General. I suspect that the natural frequency of this particular energy-based life form confines to a certain variety of electromagnetically active rock. This would be this life form's natural environment, as it were, and while this rock may very well interfere with an ordinary comm signal, its conductive properties should actually enable it to resonate with and reinforce the properly modulated. I get it. Can you reproduce this modulation? Can you run it through the ship's comms? Well, in all modesty, perhaps R2 will be more. Lando gritted his teeth against an almost overpowering urge to twist C-3PO's head off. Can you do it? I am fluent in over. Don't tell me. Lando pointed at the comm boards. Tell the ship. I may have to pause the review here just for a moment, because I think just review this part, because I'm going to forget about it probably. It's a really funny conversation. Actually, I'll probably cover the 3 sections here, and then we'll cover the other bits, the other 3 in a moment. So for these first 3 sections, again, it's good to see Luke's determination, and it's nice to see that kind of communication, and the little conversation about the Jedi of the past and Anakin between Luke and Nick. It's quite interesting, and you also feel a bit sorry for Luke, because through Nick, he's hearing how the rest of the galaxy see the events. He hears how the rest of the galaxy sees what happened, and you see how it kind of makes him a bit upset, because he knows the actuality of events. He knows that Vader is Anakin, but he's not telling Nick. It's not telling Nick, and you see how he's upset about that. Another thing that I think it was also quite interesting with that, you know, in that scene as well, was how, you know, he's quite literally willing to do anything to rescue Leia. He's quite literally willing to do anything to rescue Leia. And his friends. So you really see that side of him really coming through, because it's not really as much as, you know, Luke. We know he will. We already know, you know. We already know that he would do anything to save his friends. But there's a sort of ferocity in this scene when he says that isn't really present in, like, say, The Empire Strikes Back, and it really feels, it almost feels a bit like at least for me, some of the scenes in Doctor Who where you have the Doctor where he gets serious and really serious about saving his companion. We always is a very moment. You know something's about, you know, something really tough, something really that, you know, he's about to put all the villains in their place for that story. You know, you can't get the same feeling with it here. As for Leia, Han and Chewie, Leia throughout the rest of this chapter feels a lot more like Leia. You know, that I brought it up in my last review, or the review before, I think. For some reason, Leia, she just hasn't been clicking for me in this book. There's just something about her in this book that just doesn't feel like Leia. You know, she felt a bit more childish, and there were a couple moments, you know, I think it was the previous chapter that I think were Leia, but for the most part throughout this book, you know, she hasn't really felt like Leia. But now she's starting to feel like Leia. You know, she's a lot more like Leia here now, and it's a banter with Han. You know, it's both funny. It's got that. Again, she's got that no nonsense thing about her. But it's also a conversation between friends. It's also focusing on the battle. You know, there's a lot going on in their conversation, some of their conversations in this part of the chapter, which is really fun to see. And then of course we have Lando and C-3PO, which again, I was under the impression the capital ships were already in the atmosphere. I was under that impression already. But I guess not then. Personally, I really found that talk between Lando and 3PO to be funny, because again, you just know how frustrated Lando is. You know, 3PO really loves geeking out at stuff, but Lando, you know, he just wants C-3PO to get to the point and say it in the most simplest terms possible. The reason why I'm not complaining about all the technical terms here is because even the book acknowledges the technical terms are ridiculous in this scene, and they're meant to be ridiculous. They're meant to be time consuming. They're meant to make you want to pull your ears out and just tell off 3PO to get to the point. You know, the whole conversation is annoyingly funny. And I'll say annoyingly because if it were actually in that conversation, it would be annoying, but it's very funny to read. And especially, you know, with how a bit pompous 3PO can be. Which only makes it funnier. Yeah, it was, and of course, it's just a it's a funny chapter to read as well. And of course, you know, 3PO getting stuck under the security console, and our Lando just knows if he doesn't send anyone to help 3PO, he's just gonna yell for help until someone comes round to finally help him, and it's gonna drive everyone on the bridge nuts if he doesn't send anyone to help him. So you know, it's quite funny. But anyway. Now we'll continue the summary for the second part, for the other 3 parts. So Luke and Nick have made their way over to the Falcon. They've, of course, have jumped down and they've scrambled up all the cinders. And Nick asks what they do. And Luke says, do we knock? And Luke says it's no comlink and they have to get their attention somehow. And when Nick asks where the hatch is, Luke gestures up. Pardon me. Luke gestures up to the Falcon at a 60-degree angle at its underside to the hatch. And Nick says that maybe they can climb. And Luke suggests they could climb, and Nick says that wouldn't be a problem because he grew up in a jungle. But Luke feels something's wrong in the ship. And then Luke feels a move or diving, and someone on the Falcon's turret starts opening fire on the two of them. Nick starts climbing the Falcon. Luke gets behind a boulder, and Nick winds up going on the viewport of the turret, and the gunner isn't too pleased about it. Nick says, nuts to that, he can't shoot me. Here, toss me your lightsaber and I'll shut this rush cack down with one swipe. No, Nick, jump, the Falcon's equipped with a... And then Nick gets shocked with a blue-white energy. And he lands on the ground with an authoritative whoomp, as it says. And Luke finally finishes saying anti-personal field projector. And the gunner opens up again to open fire, and Luke uses the Force to push Nick back. And he then uses the Force to focus. And he struggles to because he feels Leia, the echoes of Leia's presence. But he's able to pull the circuit. It's able to pull a circuit, and it resets the quad laser turret back into position. Into its pretty much resets it into its forward fighter default position. But Luke only now has 5 seconds, but that's all he needs, and he leaps his way over to Nick, grabs him, and uses the Force to open up the hatch, and they make their way in, and they see everyone in there holding blasters to him. And Luke readies his lightsaber, and he warns them not to shoot because he's already killed too many people today. And Aona tells them to put their weapons down, and it's the Jedi and he's here to help. And Luke says, yes, I am the Jedi, and I hope I can help. And it says, that was true on enough different levels to make his stomach hurt, but on the other hand, this was the second time in a row that someone had decided not to mess with him based on who they assumed he was. Which was a trend he hoped to encourage. Where's Han? Han who? Her right hand came up, as this is Aona. Her right hand came up, but it came up empty. Listen, we need you. Listen, we need you. We need your help. Shadow Spawn's got my... No, he doesn't. No, he doesn't. Nick wheezes from behind Luke, and Aona runs over to Nick. And they have a little bit of an exchange. And Aona just asks how Nick was able to escape with a Jedi. How he escaped and what's he doing with a Jedi. And Nick says he's mostly alright. and he says that they kind of rescued each other, and he says, for escaping, as for escaping, oh, it didn't even reach 30 minutes this time. Okay, it's a general thing. Sorry, the computer screen is just turned off. And he says, well, you have noticed that the ship we're on is stuck nose first in the ground in the middle of a giant pitch barrel, haven't you? And Naona says it doesn't matter because they've got Nick, and that's all that matters. And they are, it's implied they're in a relationship. And Nick looks at the bruise on Aona, and he says he still haven't learned to talk. And Luke starts asking where Han is, and they have a bit of an exchange. And Aona's insistent that she doesn't know who Han is, but eventually Aona says, okay, look, can we make a deal? Sure, Luke says, this deal. You tell me everything I want to know and do exactly as I say. In exchange, I'll try to forget that you stole my best friend's ship and abandon him and my sister to die. Your sister? Your sister is Princess Kissyface. My sister is a princess. Princess Leia Organa of Alderaan, Luke said evenly, and if you called her Princess Kissyface in person, I can guess who gave you that shiner. And Nick rubs his eyes and says, Aona, you didn't really pirate this ship, did you? And Aona tries to say, well, what would have you have done for me? And Nick says that he can sense, he knows knows Shadow Spawn's forces are coming. And Luke asks if he's sure, and Nick points to the scar around his head. And that stretches from temple to temple. And he says, wait for... And Aona asks, who's going to waste their time blasting the crashed ship? Wait 5 seconds and you can ask them. But he's barely able to get the words out before the ramp gets blown off and throws flaming slag into the cargo holds, and that sets the whole place on fire. And then we cut back over to Leia and R2, Chewie and Han. And Han's embracing Leia. And he says that he's just sorry that things went this way, and he just wishes they had more time together. And Leia says that she knows, and Han says, how is it we only kissed when we're about to get killed? Just lucky, I guess. And they have a very quick kiss. And then Chewbacca starts calling out for Han, and Han makes his way over, and they see a Mon Calamari there. And he's still alive, though faintly, and Han says that looks like that some more of them might be alive too, out cold but breathing. And there's an insignia on the Mon Cal's side, and R2 aims the light at it, and they see it's the Justice. And they see other lava gear of the... they see a number of Mindorese and other Republic soldiers there, but most of the lava gear of the Mindorese are actually stormtroopers. And nearly all of them are dead. And then R2 gives a whistle of a warning, and they see the melters coming back through the tunnel into toward the cavern. And Han and Leia get their blasters out, and Leia says to trust in the Force, and Han says, you trust in the Force, I'll trust my blaster. And Leia frowns at her blaster's power indicator, and she says the Force never runs out of ammo. And Han goes, no, then how come it's not shooting? And Leia asks whatever happened to never tell me the odds, and they start having a bit more of a bicker. And then Han's comlinks turns up, crackles, but he's not unable to get anything. They start moving toward the cavern's mouth, and then the creatures start melting out of the walls. And we cut back to Chronal, and we're told about how if he is able to how Leia has just as much potential as Luke, but the difference is she has no training, so he can much more easily take her over. And she also has a tremendous amount of political potential as well. And so that the only difficulty was that he had to retrieve Leia from the Wild Melters and get a darkening underway. And we're told is a bit more complicated because all of his best pawns are lying dead on the floor. But we're told about how the Dark anticipated and provided for the every need of its most assiduous servant. And we're told that he still has the prototype. And that's we're told that it's not quite perfect though, because he wasn't as strong as Luke. He didn't have the training, and a couple of other things. I really just want to get this over with. And he had a connection to the power of the dark that rivaled Gronal Zone. He was, a fugitive, and he has he has an abnormality in his brain that Gronal was unable to repair, which impaired his power of human speech. But all of which we're told that all of this made him less than ideal as a permanent body, but as a remote body, where he was also powerfully strong in the Force. But as a remote body with which Gronal can exert the whole of his powers without risk to himself, this is perfect for him. And it's always, after all, when one needed to job them properly. And so Gronal closed his eyes, brought the sunset crown down from its resting place onto his hairless scalp, and when he opened his eyes again, the eyes he opened were not his, they were the eyes of Car Vasta. And that's where we end the chapter, and we also are told a little bit in this Gronal section. A bit about how the Force has interfered with the dark, sometimes interferes with the dark, and how the Jedi and the Sith, fear of the Force, is something he would laugh at if the Force doesn't interfere with the dark. So yeah, for that second section, again, that whole sequence of the quad turrets. Again, this is probably the least interesting of these two halves of the chapter. I don't really have as much to say about this. We know that now. I know how Car Vasta's going to be involved in this story now as a body for Gronal to control. So I don't really have a whole lot to say on that though. For I guess the Han and Leia bits is probably that. The second Han and Leia bits is probably the one I have the most to talk about with. It's quite. I wonder if one of those Mon Calamari is Tupperimi. And now at least we know what happened to Tupperimi and the other Republic guys. I don't have a whole lot to say with this. It was surprising to see Aona recognise Nick. That was something I wasn't expecting. But it was also quite welcome. It's nice to see them two together. But yeah, still Aona's a bit with what happened with the whole Han ordeal. How they stole the Falcon. Also, again, some of the interactions between Luke and Nick are quite funny. They are quite funny. But yeah. A lot of this for Luke, Nick, Leia, Han, Chewie, R2, it's just how are they going to get out of this one, And I know I keep bringing that up quite a few times, but it is how are they going to get out of this one. So yeah. I don't have as much to say on this section, unfortunately. again, I'm probably just going to have to cut this down to one chapter a day. I'm struggling so much with how long these chapters are. It was fine when 16 chapters was more common, but considering, you know, this was chapter 14, we have 15, 16, 17 and 18, 4 more. I could try and read chapter 15, and then I'd have 16 and 17 tomorrow, and then 18 and the debriefing the day after, but I just don't know if I could manage that. I don't think I'll be able to manage that. I don't think I'll be able to manage chapter 15 today. What I might need to just do is have a day's break, then return to the book. Or maybe just go on for another couple of days, or another day, with only one chapter. Then maybe try and push 2 chapters again. I'll figure it out. I'll figure it out. I just don't think I'll be able to push 2 chapters with how long these chapters are going at the moment. So yeah. But anyway, I enjoyed this chapter. I was able to even though it did take me a really long time to finish it, I felt like I was breezing through this chapter a bit more than I have with the others, which I think that's a nice sensation to have. Especially with how this whole book really has been a bit with getting through it. Even with the good chapters, you know, they have, even those ones, I've been a bit with trying to get through just because there's so much I have to keep pausing to look up for the words and stuff. But I enjoyed it. I enjoyed this book. I enjoyed it. Yeah. I think that brings an end to this review. I have nothing else to say, so thank you all for watching, and goodbye.